Hi, I'm Jonathan Katz-Moses, and today I'm really excited to share with you this 4-in-1 crosscut sled I just made. It performs multiple functions, including a picture frame miter, a standard crosscut. It does a 45-degree crosscut and a Dado crosscut as well. It accomplishes this by using movable runners. I put threaded inserts in the bottom of the sled so that you can move the runners. Both fences are square so it can be reversed. The picture frame miter comes off, and I cut holes in the fence so you can cut any size stock. They work great as hooks so you can put it on the wall when you're done. This is a really versatile sled, and I packed a lot of information into this video. So whether you're building this sled or a standard crosscut sled, I think there's a lot of things you'll find very interesting. I broke down the William Ing's 5-cut method in a really easy to understand way. I ran into a couple issues while making this. The first one being I tried to use UHMW runners. They've worked great for me in the past with much smaller sleds, but I quickly found out that they were just not up to the task for this type of sled. So you'll see during the video I switched from UHMW to maple runners. So if there's some continuity issues, that's why. The other issue I ran into was stop blocks. I had just one heck of a time trying to find a stop block that was the right size. You know, with a crosscut sled, you want a taller fence because you obviously don't want to get your fingers anywhere near the blade. There was almost no stop blocks on the market that could reach the base of my sled. And then the one that did had so much deflection that it would be almost impossible to do repeatable cuts. I'm cranking down as hard as I can on this, and it's so easy to move that. So I'm really excited to announce that I'm going to be releasing a stop block of my own design. This is the prototype. It's absolutely universal, so it goes from 2 inches to 4 inches. It can come out from the fence, so it can be out for larger stock or in for smaller stock. It has 0 deflection. You cannot move this thing. It has a micro adjust feature, so if you get really close to your cut but you don't want to move your stop block, you can micro adjust the face of it. It also can be used in any orientation. So if you had something like a drill press table where your T-track was in your fence, you could use it in this orientation, or if you wanted to put T-track in the face of the fence of your crosscut sled for larger stock, you could put it here and it could go from 2 to 4 inches out. So this is going to be for pre-sale on my website. It's going to ship in about 4 to 6 weeks. I'm really excited, so I hope you check it out. There'll be a link down in the description. Let me show you how I built this. We're going to get started by breaking down our lumber. After rough dimensioning my 3/4 sheet of ACX, I started cutting down stock for the fences. After that, I squared up the base, which ended up being about 3 feet wide. I glued up both fences in one set of clamps. I used this great trick that Nick Ferry recently released a video on. Basically, you use 2 parallel clamps on the sides to keep everything aligned, clamp everything up as you normally would, and then when you have pressure on everything, you can just take the parallel clamps off. It worked so well that I barely had to clean up the edges. It was a great tip. I also took this opportunity to cut up the picture frame miter attachment. I used my combination square to set my piece at 45 degrees on my jointing straight line rip jig. It's important to cut one piece smaller than the other so that when you join them together, you have a place to put your thumbs when you're cross-cutting your picture frame miters. You can see how that's going to work here during the glue up. It's really important that you get this square, so I used my pin nailer to make sure it didn't move before I clamped it up. I like to use my calipers to make sure I get a really snug fit for my runners. It's easy to sand them down later to fit, but if you cut them too narrow now, you're going to have trouble keeping your sled from moving around. When drilling the holes for your runners, it's really important to follow an order of operations. First, you find the center of your runner and punch it with a center punch. Then drill a small hole where you center punched. I did this through both runners at the same time so they would have perfectly aligned holes. Then, using a 3/4 inch Forstner bit, I set the depth and drilled out the recess for my socket head cap screws. Now it's time to attach the runners to the body. I used some pennies in the miter slot to raise my runners up and some double stick tape. Here's a little trick I like to use. I set the fence exactly at the width that I want the body of my sled to sit, and then I take offcuts from my plywood, clamp them against the cast iron of my table saw, and that allows me to put the base of my sled exactly where I want it without having to worry about it. It isn't absolutely crucial to do it with this level of accuracy, but it will save you a lot of frustration later down the road. So if you have a friend around like Josue, I suggest you get this as close as you can to square. Then flip the base of your sled around and center punch all the holes. This is what I think is the most crucial part of the project, getting these holes dead on. So it really helps if you fall in order of operations. Again, mark the center of your holes and drill them out with a smaller drill bit. Then when you remove the runners, you can find an exact center for your bigger drill bit, and that'll take the threaded inserts. I labeled my runners to keep them from getting confused. Although I tried to drill the holes in the exact same spot, you never know, so I didn't want to mix them up later down the road. Using a combination square, I drilled my holes as plumb and square as possible. It helps if you have a stop for your drill bit, but if not, use a marker or a piece of tape to mark your depth. When you put your threaded inserts in, make sure you do them just below the surface. This will ensure you get as much of your threads into them as possible. The threaded inserts may raise up some wood, so when you're done, give them a light sanding to ensure that they're flush. Once you've put in all your threaded inserts, it's time to screw in the runners. Keep close watch that one screw didn't get in the wrong place. If it did, it'll slightly bow the runner. You can either re-drill your holes in a different location or eliminate that screw altogether. Now it's time to attach the fences. Here I'm laying out for where my picture frame miter will go. I made my holes about 4 inches because I think that's the largest stock I'll ever cut. It's important that your holes don't interfere with the corners of your insert, so be extra careful to make sure that your openings are large enough. I took off the clamps and transferred those holes to my fence. It was then time to clean up the edges and make sure that they were nice and square and had no glue on them. It was at this point that I think I realized I had forgotten to turn on my dust collector. When clearing out large areas of material, I first like to define my edges. That way I can just go ahead and go to town on the middle. A little tip here is to use a 3/4 inch Dado stack. That way you don't have to change blades for cutting in the slot for your T-track. Using a set of calipers, I measured the depth I needed to cut for my T-track. It's always a good idea to check and make sure you're on the right track. Make sure you're going slow on this cut. You're removing a lot of material, so you don't want to force it. I then used a chisel to clean out anything that the Dado stack left behind and got ready to chamfer the corners. I decided to screw in my T-track rather than gluing it, and here's a great little tip. I use a drill bit that's slightly larger than the head of the screw, and I go very slow until I see the wood just barely poke through the bottom of the hole. This allows you to countersink in areas where you can't get a traditional countersink bit. You can use woodworking tools to trim aluminum, so I just used my beam saw to square up the ends and cut off the excess aluminum. When attaching my fences, I like to use a framing square to get it as square as possible before I shoot in screws. I was really careful to lay out where all the kerfs would be so I didn't put any screws anywhere near that area. I then drilled and countersunk holes and put screws in. I like to put my kerf almost all the way through the sled before attaching my last fence. This helps me get a lot closer to square before I dial it in with the 5-cut method. Then I get it as close to square as possible, clamp it, make sure the face is square, and shoot in 2 screws. One kind of in the middle of the end, and then one right at the corner. That's going to be my pivot screw for the 5-cut method. William Ing's 5-cut method can be a little intimidating, so I've broke it down as simply as I can. Basically, you calculate the error per inch and multiply that by the distance between your pivot screw and the corner of your fence. Cut your board on the same side of the blade as where you're going to move your fence. If it's a positive number, the fence is going to move towards you, and if it's a negative number, it's going to move away from you. I'm going to show you how I calculated it here and give you all of my figures. That way you can see exactly how it's done. Taking an offcut of plywood, you're going to cut all 4 sides one after another. Your 5th cut will remove a piece that you're going to label A and B. Measure your pieces and subtract them from each other and divide by 4. Then divide by the length of your final cut, and this is going to give you your error ratio per inch. My error ratio was pretty small, but because my fence was so long, it ended up being 2/100ths of an error. And because it's a positive number, I'm going to move that fence towards me. Using a offcut, I clamped it directly against my fence and removed the screw holding the fence in place. I then put a .02 feeler gauge in between my board and the fence and screwed the screw back in. And that should make my fence completely square. I didn't show it on camera, but I reran the 5-cut method to ensure that my fence really was square before I drilled holes and shot screws to attach my fence permanently. I took this opportunity to fix the mistakes from the UHMW and filled all the holes from my previous multiple attempts at the 5-cut method. Now it's time to attach the insert for the picture frame miter. Using double stick tape, I aligned the corner perfectly with the center of the curve. This doesn't have to be dead on, but it's got to be pretty close. Then I punched holes, and a lot like my runners, I followed an order of operations. First, I drilled larger holes with a Forstner bit. I used a marker to mark the depth. And then, using the center of that hole, I drilled through with a smaller drill bit. I then used a center punch to get the dead center of the holes. Remember, accuracy is key here, so take your time to do this. Then, just like the runners, I drilled holes for the threaded inserts. I used a combination square to make sure they were plumb and square and put the threaded inserts just below flush. I then screwed it to the base of the sled. After that, it's just as easy as separating the 2 pieces. It was a really good feeling when they came out perfectly square. Now it's time to move the runners. This is going to be a lot of rinse and repeat, but it's incredibly crucial that we get things very accurate. Again, using pennies, double stick tape, and a shim, we're going to spin the sled around and attach the runner in its alternate location. Because one runner was already attached, placing a shim in the center really helped me with alignment and kept the other runner from getting stuck prematurely. I held a finger under one side of the sled and slid the shim out and then dropped it right in place, making sure to press down to ensure the runner was stuck on there good. Because the holes had been enlarged by the screws, I used a drill bit that was the same size as the hole to lightly mark the center locations. Then, once the runner was removed, I could center punch them and make them deeper. Just like before, we drill out the holes for the threaded inserts. Remember to give them a light sanding to ensure everything's nice and flat. I had one threaded insert that moved due to a knot in the wood, and because we put 5 holes in the runner, I could just eliminate that screw and it didn't affect the alignment at all. Then it was time to set the blade to 45 degrees and make my initial crosscut. This was a great feeling because now we're on the home stretch. After a few false starts, this thing is really starting to come together. Then we do the 5-cut method just like before. It's a little bit trickier with a 45-degree cut in that you just have to make sure that your board doesn't twist in your calipers. Other than that, it's exactly the same. By an amazing stroke of luck, my fence was dead square. I didn't actually have to do any adjustments at all. Now we're going to switch the runners again and cut the Dado side. I've labeled them here so you don't get confused. Basically, A moves from one side to the other and B moves from one side to the other. It's important not to get them mixed up here, otherwise you can get holes that are maybe not in the exact same location. And then again, we just rinse and repeat. Put some coins in, a shim, place your runner in, and set your sled down in the right location. If you haven't yet, check me out on Instagram. It's a great way to keep up with what we're up to in the shop. We do lots of giveaways and post pictures of what we're up to on a daily basis. Head on over there and subscribe at Katz-Moses. Then I stacked up the inside and outside blades of my Dado stack and got ready to cut the curve. It wasn't necessary, but I went ahead and did the 5-cut method anyways. I wanted to make sure that there was no chance that my fence had gotten bowed or maybe a screw had been put in the wrong place. Turned out everything was perfect. I then went ahead and routed the slot for the T-track and screwed it in the same way I did before. In the description of the video, you'll find a link to the pre-sale of my stop block and a link to all the tools I used here today. Subscribe if you're new here, give this video a like, and follow me on Instagram. You can support me on Patreon if you like, and thank you so much for watching. All your comments are read and appreciated. Have a wonderful day and stay safe in the shop.